I drove for Uber a few nights a week after work, just to make some extra money. That night, sometime around 1:30 in the morning, I picked up a woman from a small diner outside Knoxville. At first, she seemed just like any other passenger, but the farther we drove, My name's Edward. I'm 34 now, but this happened a few years ago when I was 31 and living alone in Knoxville, Tennessee. At the time, life was all right, not amazing, not terrible. I had a decent apartment, a steady job, and enough money to pay my bills every month. The problem was, that was about it. By the time rent, groceries, gas, utilities, and everything else came out of my paycheck, there wasn't much left. I wasn't buried in debt or anything like that. I just always felt like I was one unexpected expense away from falling behind. During the day, I worked as an office administrator for a local manufacturing company. Whenever people asked what I did for work, I'd usually laugh and tell them I was the guy who fixed everyone else's problems before they became bigger problems. That wasn't my official job description, obviously, but that's what it felt like most days. My mornings usually started with a full inbox before I'd even had my first cup of coffee. Somebody needed purchase orders printed. Somebody else had forgotten to reserve a conference room. A shipment hadn't arrived. A vendor was calling. HR needed paperwork. Finance was waiting on signatures. One department needed office supplies, while another wanted me to move 3 different meetings because somebody important suddenly couldn't make it. None of those things were difficult on their own. The problem was that they all happened at the same time. By lunchtime, I'd already answered dozens of emails, taken more phone calls than I cared to count, and walked back and forth across the office so many times that my smartwatch thought I'd gone for a workout. People think office jobs are relaxing because you're sitting down all day. They're not. You're constantly switching from one problem to another, trying to remember what you were doing before somebody interrupted you with something that suddenly became urgent. By 5 o'clock, I wasn't physically exhausted. Mentally, I was done. Some evenings I'd get home, kick my shoes off by the door, throw my keys on the kitchen counter, and just sit on the couch without turning the TV on. I'd stare at the blank screen for 5 or 10 minutes, letting my brain catch up with the rest of me. If money hadn't been tight, I probably would have stayed there. Instead, I'd change into a hoodie, grab another coffee, open the Uber app, and head back out. I never planned on becoming a rideshare driver. It started because I wanted a little extra breathing room financially. Rent seemed to go up every year. Groceries definitely did. Every month there was always something. New tires, a higher electric bill, a doctor's appointment, something breaking around the apartment. Driving a few evenings every week made life a little less stressful. At least, that was the idea. I only drove 3 or 4 nights a week after work, never full-time. I honestly don't know how the people who drove 12 hours a day managed to do it. After 8 or 9 hours in an office, 5 more hours behind the wheel already felt like enough. Still, I didn't hate it. Some nights were actually enjoyable. You met interesting people, not the crazy internet story kind of interesting, just ordinary people. People coming home from work, college students heading back to campus, couples coming back from dinner, nurses finishing late shifts, tourists asking for restaurant recommendations I usually wasn't qualified to give. Sometimes passengers wanted to talk, sometimes they didn't. Either way was fine with me. If they were friendly and I still had some energy left, we'd usually end up having a decent conversation. If they wanted a quiet ride, I was more than happy to give them one. Truth be told, my mood depended almost entirely on how my day at the office had gone. If work had been relatively calm, I'd probably be in a pretty good mood. I'd joke with passengers. We'd laugh about traffic or complain about Tennessee weather changing every 5 minutes. Those rides usually flew by. Other nights, I barely had enough energy to hold a conversation. I'd still greet everyone politely. "Hey, how's it going?" I'd confirm their name, confirm the destination, ask if they were comfortable. After that, I'd mostly let the GPS do the talking. Not because I was unfriendly, I was just tired. Most people understood that. Over those couple of years, I met all kinds of passengers. Nothing unbelievable. Nothing you'd make a movie about. Just the sort of people you'd expect to meet driving around a city at night. I remember one guy asking if he could smoke in the back seat. I apologized and told him I didn't allow smoking in the car. He looked at me like I'd just insulted his entire family. The rest of the ride was painfully awkward. Another time I picked up a young couple after what I assumed was date night. They started arguing quietly about 5 minutes into the ride. Apparently, one of them had forgotten an anniversary. By the time I dropped them off, I wasn't sure whether they were about to get married or break up. Then there were people who talked nonstop from the second they got in until the second they got out, and others who didn't say a single word except "thank you" when the ride was over. That was probably my favorite part about the job. You never really knew who was about to get into your car. For 20 minutes or so, your worlds crossed. Then they disappeared back into their own lives, and you moved on to the next passenger. I can't honestly say I was ever scared driving at night. Careful, sure. Alert, always. But scared? Not really. After a while, it just became routine. You learn to trust your instincts. If somebody felt off, you noticed. If somebody seemed harmless, you relaxed a little. Most nights passed without anything worth remembering. Looking back now, I actually wish that Thursday had been one of those nights. It had been a long day at work, longer than usual. By the time I started driving that evening, I already knew I wasn't going to stay out very late. Business had been slow all night. I'd completed a few short rides, made enough money that coming out hadn't been a complete waste of time, and I was seriously thinking about calling it quits. I remember pulling into a small parking lot just to finish the last few sips of my coffee. It had gone cold almost an hour earlier, but I drank it anyway. I checked the time on the dashboard, a little after 1:30 in the morning. I'd usually survive on 5 hours of sleep those nights, grab a large coffee the next morning, and promise myself I'd stop driving. After I caught up financially, I picked up my phone and looked at the Uber app. One more decent fare. That was all I wanted. I figured one more ride would at least cover the gas I'd burned driving around that night. After that, I was heading home, almost as if the app had heard me thinking. My phone chimed. A new ride request. The pickup was less than 5 minutes away. I remember staring at the screen for a second before accepting it. I smiled to myself, started the engine, and quietly said, "One last ride. Then I'm calling it a night." The GPS brought me to a small 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Knoxville. Nothing fancy. A faded neon sign out front, a handful of pickup trucks scattered around the parking lot, and a couple of people sitting inside near the windows finishing late dinners. I pulled into one of the pickup spots and tapped "I've arrived" on the app. I leaned back in my seat, picked up my coffee, and took one last sip even though it had gone cold a while ago. The front door opened. A middle-aged couple walked out carrying leftovers and headed toward an SUV parked a few spaces away. A minute later, another guy came outside, lit a cigarette, and stayed near the entrance. I glanced back at my phone, still waiting. Just as I was about to look toward the diner again, I heard a light knock against my driver's window. I looked up. Standing beside the car was a woman who looked like she was somewhere in her late 20s. She had shoulder-length dark brown hair, a black jacket over a light gray sweater, dark blue jeans, white sneakers, and a small brown paper takeout bag tucked under one arm. She looked completely ordinary, the kind of person you probably passed every single day without paying much attention. She leaned down slightly and asked, "Edward?" "Yeah." I unlocked the doors. She climbed into the back seat, set the paper bag beside her, and quietly closed the door. "Hey, I'm Edward." "I'm Maria." "Nice to meet you." "You too." I tapped start ride and pulled out of the parking lot. I got onto the main road and followed the GPS. For the first minute or so, neither of us said much. That wasn't unusual. Some passengers started talking before we'd even left the parking lot. Others preferred a little silence first. Either way was fine with me. I glanced at the paper bag resting beside her. "Looks like they finally got your order out." She looked down at it. "Yeah, they were taking forever." I smiled. "I guess that's the downside of being one of the only places still open this late." "I guess." The conversation ended there, not because either of us was trying to end it. It just ended. The radio played quietly in the background while we drove through a couple of empty intersections. A minute or so later, she spoke again. "So, you do this every night?" I shook my head. "No, just a few evenings every week. I've got a regular office job during the day." "What do you do?" "Office administrator." I laughed to myself. It sounds a lot more organized than it actually is. She looked at me through the rearview mirror. "What does that mean?" "A little bit of everything. Emails, paperwork, scheduling meetings, fixing problems that somehow become my problems." She gave a small nod. "So, everybody bothers you?" I laughed. "Pretty much. That's probably the shortest description of my job I've ever heard." For just a second, the corner of her mouth lifted ever so slightly. Not really a smile, more like she appreciated the joke. Then her expression settled right back where it had been. "You?" I asked. "What do you do?" She looked out the window for a few seconds before answering. "Oh, nothing much. Just enough to make a living." I smiled. "Fair enough." That was all she said. I didn't push the conversation any further. Driving people around for a couple of years had taught me that everyone had their own limit when it came to small talk. Some passengers would tell you their entire life story before you'd gone 3 blocks. Others answered only what they wanted to answer. After a while, you got pretty good at reading which one you were dealing with. Maria struck me as someone who simply wasn't interested in talking about herself. There wasn't anything strange about that, so I let it go. The conversation drifted off again. Outside, the roads had become noticeably quieter. Most of the traffic had disappeared. Every now and then, another car would pass us going the opposite direction, but otherwise it was just us. The sound of the tires on the pavement and the GPS quietly announcing the next turn. Maria rested one arm against the door and watched the passing streetlights through the window. She didn't seem upset, she didn't seem nervous, she just seemed quiet. After another minute or so, without looking away from the window, she asked, "Do you ever get tired of driving people around?" "Sometimes. It mostly depends on how my day at work went. If it's been a rough day, I'm usually just counting the minutes until I can get home. And if it wasn't, I don't mind talking. Makes the drive go by a little faster." She nodded slowly. "I suppose talking makes most things go by faster." "I guess it does." A few more seconds passed. Then she said, almost to herself, "I've always found silence easier." I glanced at her in the mirror. "I can respect that." She gave a small nod and turned her attention back to the darkness outside the window. For the next minute or so, neither of us said anything. I didn't mind. She didn't seem like the kind of passenger who felt the need to fill every quiet moment with conversation, and after a long day at work, I honestly didn't either. The tires hummed steadily against the pavement while we made our way through the quieter part of the city. A couple of traffic lights changed from green to yellow before we reached them. A few late-night restaurants were still open, but for the most part, Knoxville had already gone to sleep. I glanced at the GPS. We still had a little while before we reached her destination. Without really thinking about it, I asked, "So, were you meeting someone at the diner?" She shook her head. "No, just getting something to eat." "Couldn't sleep?" She looked out the window. "I don't sleep very well." I nodded. I know the feeling. That answer could have meant 100 different things. Stress, work, life. I didn't think much of it. A few seconds later she asked, "Do you ever get nervous driving this late?" "Not really. Never." I shrugged. "I mean, you stay aware. You lock your doors. You pay attention. But if you spent every ride worrying about who was sitting behind you, you'd probably quit after a week." She nodded slowly. "I suppose that's true." Silence settled over the car again. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she asked, "Have you ever had someone threaten you?" I laughed once. "No. Thankfully. A few rude passengers here and there. Nothing serious." She looked down at her hands. "I think I'd be nervous, driving strangers around all night. I don't know. I guess after a while you stop thinking about it." She was quiet for another few seconds. Then she asked, "You don't carry anything with you?" I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Something to protect yourself." I smiled. "No." "No baseball bat?" "No." "Taser?" I chuckled. "No." "Nothing?" "No." She looked back out the window. I smiled to myself. Should I? You pick up strangers for a living. Most of them are normal. Most. The way she said that word made me glance up at the mirror for just a second. Not because I felt threatened, just because. She sounded completely serious. I laughed lightly. "You're making my job sound a lot more dangerous than it actually is." She didn't laugh back. "I don't think it is dangerous." She paused. "I just think people forget how little they actually know about the person sitting next to them." I smiled, trying to keep the conversation light. "I guess that's true for just about everybody, I suppose." Another few seconds passed. Then she spoke again. "What if someone got into your car carrying a knife?" I laughed automatically. I'd hope I never found out. What if they were? I smiled through the mirror. Should I be worried? She looked up. For the first time since she'd gotten into the car, our eyes met in the rearview mirror. There was the slightest hint of a smirk. Maybe. There was just enough of a pause afterward that I wasn't entirely sure whether she was joking. I laughed again. This time it sounded a little more forced. "You're messing with me." Another second passed, then she let out a quiet laugh. "Relax, I'm kidding." I smiled. "That's one way to keep your Uber driver awake." She gave a tiny shrug. "I was just curious." The conversation drifted off again. I looked back toward the windshield. Honestly, I wasn't scared, not even close. But I'd be lying if I said the conversation hadn't made me just a little more aware of the fact that it was nearly 2 in the morning, and I was alone in a car with someone I'd met less than 15 minutes earlier. Without really realizing it, I found myself checking the rearview mirror a little more often than I had before. Every time I looked, she was doing the same thing, sitting quietly, looking out the window, watching the darkness roll by. After another minute or two, she spoke again. "Do you know this part of town very well?" "Pretty well. Not every road, but enough." She nodded. I don't come out here very often. I glanced at the GPS again. The highlighted route had left the busier streets behind. We were heading farther toward the edge of the city now. The destination was on a county road I'd never driven before. I didn't think much of it. I figured there was probably a house tucked back in the trees somewhere that the GPS wasn't showing. Late-night pickups in quieter neighborhoods weren't exactly unusual. So, I said, "Do you have family around here?" She was quiet for a moment. "My parents passed away when I was young." I glanced at her in the mirror. "I'm sorry." She nodded once. "It's all right. It was a long time ago. I've got a younger sister. We've always looked after each other." I smiled. "That's good." She looked out into the darkness again. "You don't really get a choice. You just do." There was something about the way she said it. Not emotional, not sad, just matter of fact. Like she was describing the weather. For some reason, that stayed with me. Not because of what she said, because of how she said it. I nodded. "I get that." Neither of us spoke again for the next little while. The roads had become noticeably darker now. Streetlights were farther apart. The traffic had almost completely disappeared. The GPS announced another turn ahead. Maria looked out into the darkness beyond the passenger side window. Then, quietly, almost as if she'd been thinking about it for a long time, she asked, "Have you ever noticed how different a place feels once there aren't any other people around?" I thought about it for a second. "What do you mean?" She kept looking out the window. "I don't know. It just feels different. When there are people around, a place feels," she searched for the word, "alive. But once everyone's gone," she shrugged lightly, "it feels like the place becomes itself again." I let out a quiet laugh. I've never really thought about it like that. I guess most people don't. Outside, the buildings had started giving way to longer stretches of road. The businesses were becoming fewer and farther apart. Streetlights were still there, but there were noticeably more dark patches between them now. I glanced at the GPS again. We weren't far from her destination anymore. "You come out this way often?" She shook her head. "No, not really. You?" I looked at the GPS. "No, I've never been on this road before." She didn't respond. For a few seconds, the only sound inside the car was the GPS quietly announcing the next turn. Then she spoke again. "Do you believe places can remember things?" I smiled. "That's a pretty deep question for almost 2 in the morning." "I'm serious." "I know." I thought about it for a second. "I don't know. I've never really thought about it." She nodded slowly. "I think they do." I glanced at her through the mirror. "You mean haunted?" She shook her head. "No, I didn't say that." Another pause. "I just think some places remember what happened there, and sometimes they don't let go very easily." I smiled awkwardly. "I think you've been watching too many documentaries." She looked directly at me through the mirror. "I don't watch documentaries." There wasn't any irritation in her voice. She was simply correcting me. I laughed quietly. "Fair enough." A few more seconds passed before I asked, "So, you mentioned your sister?" She nodded. "Is she waiting up for you?" "I imagine it's pretty late." "Probably." She looked back out the window. "But she's old enough to take care of herself." The way she said it wasn't cold. It wasn't affectionate either. It was strangely matter-of-fact, like she'd answered a question she'd been asked 100 times before. I nodded. "My younger brother's the same way. At some point, you stop worrying about every little thing, I suppose." Another brief silence settled over the car. Then she asked, "Do people ever tell you strange things?" I laughed. Depends what you consider strange. I've had people tell me about terrible first dates, bad bosses, family drama. I've probably heard enough relationship advice to write a book. That earned the faintest hint of a smile. I'm not talking about that. What then? She continued, watching the darkness outside. The things people don't usually tell anyone else. I thought about it. Sometimes. I think it's easier to tell things to someone you'll probably never see again. She nodded. I think so too. Another few seconds passed. Then, almost casually, she asked, "Have you ever driven someone somewhere and later wished you hadn't?" I smiled. No. Can't say I have. You? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the trees slipping past outside her window. After several seconds, she quietly said, "I have." I waited, thinking she might explain. She didn't. I looked back at the road ahead. For the first time since she'd gotten into the car, I realized I was hoping we'd reach her destination sooner rather than later. Not because she'd done anything wrong. She hadn't. She'd been polite the entire ride. She'd never raised her voice, never acted aggressively. There was just something about the way she spoke. Every conversation seemed to drift toward something heavier than where it had started. I couldn't decide whether she was naturally like that, or whether I was simply getting tired. The GPS chimed. In 1 mile, turn right. I glanced at the screen. The highlighted route was taking us off the main road now. A few seconds later, I made the turn. The county road was much narrower than the one we'd just left. My headlights stretched farther into the darkness now, catching nothing but trees on either side. The farther we drove, the quieter it became. I glanced back at the GPS. Less than a mile to go. I remember looking farther ahead, expecting to spot a mailbox, a gravel driveway, maybe a porch light hidden somewhere behind the trees. I didn't see any of it. The GPS spoke again. Your destination is on the right. I slowed almost to a crawl. The destination pin stopped moving. I looked toward the right side of the road. Nothing. Just trees disappearing into the darkness. This should be it, I said, looking around. I think the GPS might be a little off. I'm not really seeing anything out here. Maria looked out her window. No, it's right here. I glanced around once more. Still nothing. No driveway, no gate, no lights. So, I asked, are you meeting somebody out here? She shook her head. No. I like walking from here. I looked farther down the road. There wasn't even a sidewalk, just a narrow shoulder running alongside the trees. I couldn't help asking, "Will you be all right?" She nodded once. "I'll be fine." There wasn't the slightest bit of hesitation in her voice. She sounded completely certain. I figured she probably knew the area better than I did. People have their own routines. Who was I to question them? I shifted the car into park. She picked up the small brown paper takeout bag, opened the door, and stepped outside. The interior light came on for a moment before the door closed again. I watched her. She didn't move. She just stood there beside the car, looking at me, not smiling, not saying anything, just looking. A couple of awkward seconds passed. I lowered my window slightly. "You all right?" She blinked, almost as if I'd pulled her out of a thought. "Yeah." Then, after another brief pause, she gave the smallest nod. "Take care, Edward." "You too." She turned around and started walking, not toward a house or a driveway, just straight down the side of the road into the darkness. I watched her until I couldn't make her out anymore. I sat there for a bit, still half expecting a porch light to switch on somewhere ahead. Nothing. The trees remained completely still. I finally let out a quiet breath, locked all 4 doors almost without thinking, put the car back into drive, and pulled away. As I made my way back toward the main road, I shook my head to myself. Well, that was a new one. I drove for another 10 or 15 minutes, heading back toward the city. I couldn't quite get that ride out of my head. Something about Maria just felt off. I couldn't even explain what it was. Maybe it was the questions she'd asked. Maybe it was the way she'd answered them. Or maybe it was the place she'd chosen to get out. Whatever it was, none of it really seemed to fit together. My phone chimed. Another ride request. Still caught up in my own thoughts, I absent-mindedly tapped accept. The second it went through, I looked at the screen and sighed. What the hell am I doing? I was done for the night. For a moment, I actually thought about canceling it. Then I remembered it'd count against my driver metrics, since whoever requested the ride had already been matched with me. I let out another sigh, one more. Then I'm really going home this time. I glanced at the map. The pickup pin looked familiar. Not exactly, just somewhere around where I'd picked Maria up earlier. I figured it was probably another late-night customer leaving one of the restaurants nearby. So I turned the car around and headed that way. A couple of minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot. The moment I looked up, I quietly said, "Wait." It was the same diner, the exact same one I'd picked Maria up from earlier that night. I frowned at the building for a second. Seriously? I shook my head. What are the odds? I tapped "I've arrived" and put the car in park. The parking lot looked almost exactly the same. The faded neon sign still buzzed above the entrance. A couple of cars were different, but otherwise nothing had really changed. I leaned back in my seat and waited. About 10 seconds later, the front door opened. Someone stepped outside. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Then I noticed the black jacket. A second later, the gray sweater underneath, the dark hair. She stepped beneath the light above the entrance. My grip tightened around the steering wheel. No, I whispered to myself. She wasn't just someone who looked similar. She was Maria. The same face, the same height, the same dark hair, the same clothes. And to top it all off, she was carrying a takeaway bag too, just like when I'd picked her up earlier that night. For a second, my brain genuinely refused to make sense of what I was looking at. She started walking toward my car, slowly, calmly, like absolutely nothing was unusual. The closer she got, the more certain I became. She stopped beside my driver's window and leaned down slightly. "Edward?" The words slipped out before I even realized I was saying them. "Maria?" She looked surprised. "Yeah?" I frowned. "Wait, what are you doing back here?" "I just dropped you off." She blinked. "What?" She stared at me for a second before giving a small, confused laugh. "No, you didn't. I think you've got the wrong person. I literally just booked this ride." I just stared at her. She looked equally confused by the whole conversation. After a couple of awkward seconds, she smiled politely and said, "So, is this still my Uber?" I blinked. "Yeah, sorry." I unlocked the doors. She climbed into the back seat, placed the takeaway bag beside her, and fastened her seatbelt. I still hadn't put the car into drive. I looked at her through the rear-view mirror. She caught me looking almost immediately. "You okay?" I hesitated, then quietly asked, "Your name really is Maria?" She smiled. "Yeah. How did you know that?" I didn't answer. I just stared ahead through the windshield. Nothing about what had just happened made any sense. The woman sitting behind me was the same woman I'd dropped off earlier that night. She had the same face, the same clothes, the same name, and somehow she was acting as if we'd never met before. For the first minute or so, neither of us said anything. The only sounds in the car were the engine, the tires rolling across the pavement, and the GPS quietly giving directions every now and then. I caught myself glancing at her through the rear-view mirror once, then again, a few seconds later. The third time she caught me. She smiled. "You keep looking at me." I looked back at the road. "Sorry." She laughed softly. "It's okay." I was starting to wonder if I had something on my face. I couldn't help smiling. "No, it's not that." She waited. When I didn't say anything else, she spoke again. "So, what exactly happened back there?" I hesitated. I don't even know where to start. She smiled. "Try me." I let out a quiet breath. "I picked up a woman earlier tonight. She looked exactly like you. I mean, exactly." She raised an eyebrow. "That's gotta be pretty rare." I thought so too. I dropped her off, drove away, and then somehow ended up back at the same diner. She nodded. "And that's where you found me?" "Yeah." She looked out the passenger side window for a couple of seconds, then she smiled. "I guess I've got one of those faces." I laughed a little. "I don't think that's it." She looked back at me through the mirror. "So you really thought I was the same person?" "I would have bet money on it." She laughed. "Well, I'm glad you didn't." I laughed too. "I would have lost." "You definitely would have." The conversation settled for another few seconds. Then she asked, "So, do you drive full-time?" I shook my head. "No, I've got a regular office job. This is just something I do a few nights a week." "Really?" "Yeah, keeps the bills under control." She nodded. "I get that. What do you do during the day?" "I'm an office administrator." She smiled. "So basically the person everyone bothers when something goes wrong?" I laughed. "That's actually a pretty accurate description." I knew it. My office has one too. I don't know how she'd survive a week without caffeine. I smiled. "So what about you? What do you do?" "I'm a marketing manager." "Oh yeah?" "Mostly digital campaigns. Nothing nearly as exciting as people think it is." I smiled. "I think most jobs sound more exciting until you actually do them." She laughed. "That's probably true." For a little while, the conversation took my mind off everything that had happened. I almost forgot why I'd been staring at her in the first place. After another minute or so, I smiled. "Well, I just hope you've not got a doppelganger running around Knoxville." She laughed. "I hope not." Then, after a second, she smiled again. "Not a doppelganger. But I do have a younger sister." "Oh yeah?" "Yeah," I smiled. "Is she anything like you?" She laughed. "Depends who you ask. If you ask her, she'll tell you she's the responsible one. If you ask me, she still forgets to answer her phone half the time." I laughed. "Sounds like every younger sibling." "Pretty much." She looked out the passenger side window for a moment. Then she said, "I lost both my parents when I was a kid, so it was basically just me and my younger sister after that." The smile slowly disappeared from my face. I kept my eyes on the road. For a couple of seconds, I didn't say anything. She noticed. "You okay?" I let out a quiet breath. "It's just, I've heard that before." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "The woman I told you about. The one who looked exactly like you." I glanced at her in the mirror. She told me the exact same thing. She said she'd lost both her parents when she was young, and that she had a younger sister. Maria stared at me for a moment. "Okay, That's actually kind of creepy. A quiet silence settled between us. After a few seconds, she looked at me again. So, what was she like? I thought about it for a second. Very different from you. She smiled. Different how? She hardly talked. I felt like I had to carry most of the conversation. And when she did say something, I paused for a second. It was usually about some pretty dark stuff. She tilted her head. Dark how? She kept asking me strange questions, like whether driving alone this late at night ever bothered me, whether I carried anything to protect myself. She even asked how different a place feels when there isn't anyone else around. Maria let out a quiet laugh. Yeah, that's definitely not me. I get scared way too easily. I stay away from horror movies, haunted houses, anything like that. I smiled. So you're not the horror type? She laughed. Not even close. If a movie says it's based on a true story, I'm already out. I couldn't help laughing. Fair enough. She smiled. I'd probably have been the one getting nervous if someone started asking me those kinds of questions. I nodded. I was trying not to show it. But I'll admit, she made the ride a little uncomfortable. Maria smiled sympathetically. I don't blame you. I nodded. I wanted to believe the whole thing was just a bizarre coincidence. But the more we talked, the harder that became. For the next minute or two, neither of us said much. I kept my eyes on the road. Every now and then, I'd glance at the GPS, then back through the windshield. My mind was trying to come up with a reasonable explanation for everything that had happened. Nothing fit. Maria was the one who finally broke the silence. So, can I ask you something? Sure. If you really thought I was the same person, why did you let me get into the car? I smiled a little. Honestly, I don't know. She laughed. I was hoping you'd have a better answer than that. I think it all happened so fast. I was still trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Next thing I knew, you were already sitting behind me. She nodded. That makes sense. I let out a quiet laugh. You have no idea. She smiled. So, do you remember anything else about her? I thought about it for a moment. Not much. I never asked where she worked. I don't even know her last name. I just remember the conversation. She nodded. Did she seem scared? No. If anything, I think I was more uncomfortable than she was. She looked curious. Because of the questions? Yeah. And because she seemed completely comfortable getting dropped off in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't a house. Nothing. Maria frowned. That is strange. I thought so too. She looked out the window for a few seconds. Then she turned back toward the front. You know, if somebody dropped me off somewhere like that at this time of night, I'd probably ask them to wait until I got inside. I looked at her through the mirror. That's exactly what I would have expected. She smiled. I don't know. I've watched enough true crime documentaries to know better. I laughed. So you do like scary stuff? She immediately shook her head. Oh no, I like true crime. Horror is a different story. I can't do ghosts. I can't do haunted houses. And absolutely no Ouija boards. I laughed. So that's where you draw the line? Very firmly. I've got friends who love that stuff. They keep trying to get me to watch horror movies. No chance. I'd rather watch a comedy and sleep peacefully. I smiled. Fair enough. She smiled back. I don't need help scaring myself. I nodded. For a second, neither of us said anything. The GPS chimed. In 500 feet, your destination will be on the right. I looked up. A row of apartment buildings came into view ahead. Maria looked out the window and smiled. That's me. I slowed the car, turned into the apartment complex, and pulled up near the entrance. The place looked completely ordinary. A few cars were parked outside. Lights were still on in a handful of apartments. I shifted the car into park. Maria unbuckled her seatbelt, picked up her takeaway bag, then smiled at me. Well, I'm definitely happier getting dropped off here than out on some dark road in the middle of nowhere. I laughed. She grinned. I think I'll stick with apartment buildings. I smiled. She opened the door, then paused for a second. Oh, one thing. I looked back at her. I think that other Maria was right about one thing. I raised an eyebrow. You probably should keep something in the car. Nothing crazy, but maybe something for self-defense. She smiled. Just in case. I couldn't help laughing. Yeah, I guess this is the second time I've heard that tonight. She laughed. See? Maybe it's a sign. I smiled, shaking my head. Let's hope that's the only thing she was right about. She laughed again. It was nice meeting you, Edward. You too. She stepped out, closed the door, and gave me a small wave before walking toward the entrance. I watched her unlock the main door, disappear inside, and a few seconds later, the door quietly closed behind her. I sat there for a moment, then I put the car into drive and pulled away. I honestly started wondering if everything that had happened was nothing more than one unbelievable coincidence. A few minutes later, I pulled into a nearby gas station. I didn't need gas. I just wanted a minute to clear my head. I parked off to one side, switched the engine off, and leaned back in my seat. All right, I muttered to myself. What the hell was that? The more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself there had to be a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe I'd been more tired than I realized. Maybe my brain had exaggerated how similar the two women looked. People make mistakes. Memory isn't perfect. That made a lot more sense than anything else. I reached for my phone. One thing about driving for Uber is that every trip is recorded. You can see where you picked someone up, where you dropped them off, how much you earned, everything. I figured if I looked through the trip history, it'd probably settle my mind. I opened the driver app, tapped earnings, then trip history. The rides from that night appeared one after another. The airport passenger, the guy getting off work, the college student, then Maria, pickup, the diner, drop-off, the county road. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered it. I nodded to myself. Right. So that wasn't in my head. I scrolled down, expecting to see the next trip. Instead, there was another entry from the same diner. I frowned. I tapped it. Status: canceled by driver. I stared at the screen. What? I looked at it again. Same pickup location, same time. But instead of a destination, it simply said, canceled by driver. I felt my stomach drop. No, I whispered. I never canceled it. I opened the trip details again, then backed out. Opened them again. Nothing changed. According to Uber, I'd accepted the ride, then canceled it myself. I slowly lowered the phone into my lap. That wasn't possible. I remembered Maria getting into the car. I remembered the conversation. I remembered dropping her off at the apartment complex. I remembered watching her walk inside. None of that should have existed if I'd canceled the ride. I sat there in complete silence for what felt like several minutes. The screen was still glowing in my hand. It didn't matter how many times I looked at it. It always said the same thing. Canceled by driver. Eventually, I locked my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I had no idea what had just happened. I just wanted to go home. I didn't turn the Uber app back on that night. I drove straight to my apartment. I barely slept. The next morning, I got up, got ready for work, and tried to get on with my day. I told myself not to think about it anymore. I stayed away from the Uber app for a while. Eventually, I started driving again, but it never felt quite the same. And a few months later, I stopped altogether. It's been a few years since all of this happened. I've moved on with my life, but every once in a while, usually when I'm driving alone late at night, that ride finds its way back into my head. I've stopped trying to explain it, because I know what I saw that night, and after all these years, I still can't make sense of it.